But moving on, because we have got a lot to get through, and I want to go now to introduce you to Jim Gard'ner. Jim is the Executive Director of Statutory Planning and Heritage at the Department of Planning. Just carrying on, Jim is as an historic buildings architect. Jim worked for English Heritage and has been a project architect in various architectural practices in New Zealand and the UK. He's undertaken and overseen projects which conserve and adaptively reuse private and public-owned historic places ranging from World Heritage sites to humble miners' cottages. He's a member of several prestigious national and international organisations, including ICOMOS and the Institute on Historic Buildings Conservation. And Jim's going to talk to us today about his involvement at Christchurch Cathedral with the title "To Rebuild or Work with the Ruin, the Post-Earthquake Dilemma." Over to you, Jim.
Awesome. Thank you very much. As with all these things, there's the odd technical issue, but that will be resolved. What I'm going to do today in Christchurch Cathedral, I will look at very briefly at the end. I've had the pleasure and privilege of being involved in 2 rounds of Heritage Awards judging since the September 2010 earthquake. What I would like to do is also introduce some of the policy work that has been done across Australia by the heritage chairs and officials of Australia and New Zealand on ruins, their recognition and management in the Australian context. I'd also at this point, as well as thanking the Copland Foundation, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Christchurch Heritage Awards Charitable Trust. Ruins are an issue that's becoming increasingly important nationally. 2011, Victoria and the Commonwealth hosted a national workshop. This has resulted in the establishment of guidance entitled Ruined Places, A Guide to Their Conservation and Management. This was recognised and adopted by the heritage officials of Australia and New Zealand in August this year and should be out very shortly. But that guidance defines a ruin as a place that is currently, through abandonment, redundancy or condition, is disused and incomplete, is usually no longer maintained and appears unlikely to regain its original or substantive use, function or purpose other than interpretation. One of the things this workshop and the guidance identified is that ruins can be brought on by a number of different mechanisms. Technological changes, for instance, new methods for tobacco drying or hickory production, beer brewing or storing wheat, for instance. Political changes, such as the abolition of the monasteries in Tudor England. Demographic changes, that is, the loss or change of population. The abandoned settlements or ghost towns which were created by the loss of the need for rural support, or the end of gold rushes, for instance. And obviously things like war and deliberate destruction have played their part in creating ruins, as well as the obvious fire, flood and earthquake. I think importantly it's to note that economic changes can also have a significant impact on the on built fabric and the creation of ruins. And if the screen was working, you'd see some examples of where economic disaster has created as bigger impact as any natural disaster could possibly create. You just have to look at things like the abandoned terraced housing in the north of England, or the state of both public and private buildings in places like Detroit, Michigan, where there has been a catastrophic failure of the economic system, which has led to the ruination on a scale which is at least equal to any natural disaster. So why do we keep them? Well, I think it's fair to say that in Australia and New Zealand, we are not used to ruins. Many community groups do not like them. We like generally our heritage to look, if not restored, at least or if not new, at least restored in some way. I've been involved in a number of community groups and as a regulator where people have just not been able to comprehend or accept having a ruin in their midst. They see it as untidy, they see it as just undesirable, and they would rather demolish than retain as a ruin. However, this isn't the case in many other established communities. Now, what I might do is, because you can see a little bit, if I turn the computer round, if that's okay. And, well, that's okay. We don't need that plugged in now. And so you won't get a fantastic view, but I will. So, for instance, the point here, this is a house in Detroit and has fallen into ruination purely because of neglect and because of the changed financial situation. So, why do we keep ruins? Well, they are picturesque and do have aesthetic qualities. This is well recognised through the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. They tell a much more complete story of the past than the mere written record can. They can commemorate disasters and sometimes painful aspects of our past. And this is important when you think about places like Marble Hill, is how you retain the importance this has as a monument to that devastating 1955 fire. They're also a very cost-effective way, but not a free way, of preserving historic fabric. And they often allow heritage to be retained until imaginative adaptive reuse or restoration projects can be either found or funded. And I think the image on the computer now just shows that not all ruins are historic buildings. Australia has a very rich heritage of shipwrecks, and for all intents and purposes, these are effectively ruins. But there are mine sites, there are industrial buildings, there are timber bridges, there are fire lookout towers, there is a whole range of things which goes beyond heritage buildings. So, heritage chairs and officials identified that this was a national issue. Well, why did we do that? Well, Australia's built heritage is reaching that critical age, 100, 150, 200 years, where major elements such as roofs, rainwater goods need replacing wholesale, where walls, especially those suffering from salt damp in South Australia, need substantial repointing, where underpinning may be needed. And in some cases, those works cannot or will not be funded by their owners. This is particularly true in rural and remote areas. We're also in an environment where there is a decreased pool of funding for conservation's sake. Increasingly, for what funding is available through state and Australian government sources, the emphasis is on demonstrable community benefit. So unless you can demonstrate both good conservation outcomes and high quality community benefits, it's very difficult to get that funding. One of the things we noticed as well, looking around the national legislation, a lot of legislation does not cope well with ruins. It's there for listing traditional historic buildings. So, for instance, the New South Wales minimum standards guidance or requirements within the New South Wales legislation does not work with ruins. It requires the regular maintenance of rainwater goods, the regular painting of windows. Those kind of things do not work. Likewise in Victoria, if I went out chasing every owner who allowed their rural outbuilding on a listed property to fall into a state of disrepair where its conservation values were threatened, I think I'd be drummed out of the state, because it would be completely unreasonable to require the rural communities to maintain those buildings to the standard that was envisaged when we were listing town halls, parliament houses and government houses. We also identified in our 2008 study of all 2,500 places on the Victorian Heritage Register, that of the 70 buildings which were identified as being at risk, that is, they had no use and they were in a poor or very poor condition, a high proportion of them were actually ruins. And so even state of condition surveying didn't adequately approach what was a ruin and what was a building which had been left to deteriorate. I also believe that the Borough Charter is ill-equipped to deal with this. As a high-level philosophical document, that's fine, but it doesn't go down to the detail that we need as managers. So this new guidance, which should be out very shortly, identifies 5 approaches. Firstly, the coming alive again, and Marble Hill is used as the example of this in the case studies associated with that guidance, and that is to bring a building, a ruin, back to life. The second is to return it to its former state, so the restoration to a previously known state, to simply maintain, and that isn't a no-cost option, because maintenance of a ruin does cost money. You've got to deal with vegetation, you've got to deal with rainwater, you've got to deal with structural stability and the repair of eroded elements. The fourth was letting nature take its course, and this example was the John Batman House in Kingston, Tasmania, where basically a remote rural property is just being left to return to nature, even though it is highly significant. And the final is where removal is inevitable, either in part or in whole. And this is where there may be much greater social benefits in its removal, or the hazards and public health risks are just so great. One of the things this work skirted but never actually addressed was, should we as a society plan for some heritage places which are currently reasonably intact and standing fall into a state of ruination as a management technique? Now, that's a very, very difficult question to think about. I'll be very happy to discuss it afterwards. Now, on to New Zealand. I'd like to briefly look at the Christchurch earthquakes, and here I'm drawing on some images from a film which was commissioned by the Christchurch Heritage Awards Charitable Trust. For those of you who don't know Christchurch, it's a provincial city of about 350,000 people on the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand. There was evidence of Maori occupation since the mid-13th century, where they would hunt moa through the swamplands in the estuary between the Avon River and the Heathcote River. It was established in 1848 as a planned Church of England settlement, and its grand 19th century ecclesiastical, institutional and educational buildings were built in an English Gothic style to reflect that ethos, many by the architect Benjamin Mountford. However, on Saturday the 4th of September 2010, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck Darfield, which is 44 kilometres west of Christchurch at a depth of 11 kilometres. This caused significant damage to unreinforced masonry buildings, chimneys toppled. There was widespread structural damage to later, more recent buildings, but there were no deaths because it occurred at 4:35 on a Saturday a.m. on a Saturday morning. Now, that might say something also about Christchurch's nightlife, but nonetheless, luckily there were no deaths. I was judging Heritage Awards 1 week later from that earthquake. It was interesting. We went round houses which people had lovingly restored to see chimneys sitting in the living room floor. But the people were still proud enough in the work they had done to want to show us round their properties. However, nearly 6 months later, on Tuesday the 22nd of February 2011, an aftershock measuring 6.3 on the Richter scale struck the city at 12:51. Even though this only released 1/20th of the energy of the earlier earthquake, it was centred only 6 kilometres from the central city in Littleton Harbour and only 5 kilometres deep. This meant a much, much larger percentage of the energy actually struck Christchurch. It also recorded one of the largest ground accelerations ever recorded in an urban area, and much greater than one would expect for a 6.3 magnitude earthquake. This was a ground acceleration of 1.8 Gs vertically. Now, no unreinforced masonry building is designed to accelerate vertically at 1.8 Gs. Most modern, and that was well beyond the standards for even modern earthquakes. And although that was a lower magnitude earthquake, when you look at it, the intensity and the violence of the ground shaking, when measured on the modified Mercalli intensity scale, it recorded a 10, which is one of the most catastrophic and largest earthquakes to hit a built-up area. This caused enormous damage and the loss of 185 lives. These earthquakes were followed by 2 more aftershocks in June 2011, a 5.6, and then just a couple of hours later, a 6.3. Again, very close to the city centre. And this resulted in more liquefaction, more damage, but luckily no lives were lost. Now, although unreinforced masonry buildings did collapse, and they did terribly kill people and crush vehicles, over half the deaths from that earthquake occurred in a single 6-storey building collapse, the Canterbury Television Building, which was designed and constructed in 1986, which is the 3rd generation of earthquake standards after the Napier earthquake. That building catastrophically collapsed and caught on fire. The second greatest loss was another non-ductile reinforced concrete building, the Pine Gould Guinness building, which dated from 1964. So since the September 2010 earthquake, there have been 11,000 aftershocks. The damage to buildings and infrastructure is estimated to be between 20 and 30 billion New Zealand dollars. Liquefaction drove 400,000 tonnes of river silts to the surface. In a city of 350,000 people, 10,000 houses will need to be demolished. 100,000 will require repair. At least 1,000 of the 4,000 buildings that exist within the 4 main avenues that bound the centre of Christchurch will be demolished. And more than 300 buildings, including on the New Zealand Historic Places Trust register, have been demolished within Christchurch and the surrounding area. Now, I had the privilege of returning in September this year to judge the 2nd Heritage Awards, exactly 2 years after the first quake. And these awards celebrated the efforts that owners had made to retain their heritage buildings, often in the face of enormous opposition from the Christchurch Earthquake Reconstruction Authority and others. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes. Sorry? 10 minutes. Oh, I'm fine then. What I'd now like to do is to just briefly look at a range of responses to different kinds of loss, of fire, earthquake and war, before finishing on a brief discussion of the Christchurch Cathedral. Now, just looking on a citywide basis, many of you will know Napier. There was a devastating 7.8 magnitude earthquake in 1931 that, along with the fire afterwards, wiped out the whole of 19th and 20th century Napier. The central city was rebuilt in a particularly Kiwi form of the group of styles commonly known as Art Deco. These many buildings used Maori motifs and decorative elements based on native flora and fauna. And along with South Beach, Miami, it's one of the 2 most intact Art Deco cities in the world. It was included on New Zealand's tentative list in 2007 as a potential UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's been estimated that the work of Napier's Art Deco Trust generates more than $10 million to the local economy just from the work that trust does in promoting it for tourism and event purposes. The second example on a citywide scale is Plymouth. After devastation by the Luftwaffe bombing in March 1941, it was the only British city to have its entire central core entirely rebuilt. The reconstructed city is now really a perfect embodiment of the spirit of the 1950s. And now, over 50 years old, it can be considered a historic city in its own right. It has more 1950s listed buildings than any other city in England outside London. And English Heritage is currently seeking to have the whole of the city centre designated a conservation area. Simon Thurley, English Heritage Chief Executive, was recently in the media comparing Plymouth in architectural importance to the medieval city of York or the Georgian city of Bath. The final example here is perhaps the more typical approach you see in France. This is St Malo, a medieval walled town on the coast of Brittany. It had a colourful history as a centre for French privateering, but was substantially damaged through aerial bombing. And as I say, the alternative approach was taken here of an accurate reconstruction of the lost built form, which helps as this uses as a major point of entry for tourism into Brittany and Mont Saint-Michel. Now I'll look at 3 examples which might have some lessons for Christchurch Cathedral. This is the Reichstag in Germany. These are 3 very famous examples and will come as no surprise to most of you. This was built in 1894 following the unification of Germany in 1871. It was severely damaged by fire in 1933 and was an event which the Nazi Party used to help cement its position of power within Germany. It was largely unused from that period, but was targeted by the Soviet army when they sacked Berlin, mainly for symbolic purposes. It was restored in 1964, but its physical proximity to the Berlin Wall meant it was hardly ever used. It was agreed to become the home of the German Parliament following reunification, and in 1992, Lord Foster won the competition to create the building as the home of the German Parliament and the famous dome. It was finished in 1999, and this is now the second most visited building in Germany after Cologne Cathedral, mainly because of Lord Foster's brilliant inclusion of good, high-quality, contemporary design within the historic fabric. This next example is the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, also in Berlin. This Romanesque-style church dates from the late 19th and early 20th century. It was completely bombed out in 1943 by the RAF, which destroyed all but the spire and entrance porch. And new buildings designed by Egon Eigenmann were grouped around the old church, and the initial design included the demolition of the ruin, but it was only following pressure from the public that it was decided to incorporate it in the new design. It now commemorates the Protestant martyrs who died during the Nazi regime, and the tower was recently reconsecrated and features a cross of nails which was made from the timbers of Coventry Cathedral. Now, this is perhaps one of the most famous examples of the incorporation of ruins into new contemporary architecture. Again, this was largely destroyed by Luftwaffe bombing in 1940. However, it remained consecrated ground, and Sir Basil Spence and Sir Ove Arup's St Michael's Cathedral was built in its place. Like the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, it incorporates modern design. And although these were both very contentious at the time, they are now recognised as potent symbols of reconciliation in both post-war Britain and post-war Germany. In my view, all 3 of these demonstrate the value of waiting and considering options before acting. In these 3, the communities lived with these places, these iconic structures, for an excess of 15 or 20 years before their restoration or redevelopment. Now, I'll very briefly look at Christchurch Cathedral because I think there probably is some interest in it, if that's okay. Okay, that's fine. Excuse me. So, as I indicated, Christchurch was established as a planned Church of England settlement. It was the ambition that they would transplant English life, English ideals, and English architecture to the city. And at the very core of it was Christchurch Cathedral. It was designed by great 19th century British architect George Gilbert Scott in 1856, but the foundation stone was not laid until 1864, and the project continued to languish until young architect Benjamin Mountford took over and adapted Scott's design, and construction began again. In 1888, the North Canterbury earthquake knocked off the top 8 metres of the tower. That fell again in the 1901 Cheviot earthquake. And finally, after that, in 1903, the spire was rebuilt in Australian hardwood timber and clad in copper. In 1980, it was registered by the New Zealand Historic Places Trust as a Category 1 historic place. It is the major icon of Christchurch as a city. It is on every postcard, every snow dome, every tea towel, every fridge magnet. The September 2010 earthquake caused some superficial damage. It was closed for some months, but was soon reopened. It also demonstrated the value of the 1970s through 90s earthquake strengthening that was common amongst a lot of the Gothic institutional buildings around Christchurch. However, that strengthening was no match for the February earthquake, which severely damaged this building and left several around it in ruins. The spire that withstood the damage in 2010 completely collapsed, leaving only the lower half of the tower, and the gable end of the west front sustained major damage and was further damaged by the June earthquakes, knocking out the rose window. That led to the question being raised whether the cathedral needed to be deconsecrated and demolished. Further damage was caused by the swarm of earthquakes that occurred just before Christmas last year. So what's happening now? It was announced in October 2011 that the structure would be deconsecrated. In my view, a very bad move, because it ceases to be a cathedral. In March this year, Bishop Victoria Matthews announced that the building would be demolished. There was absurd plans to cut it down to 2 metres high, that being a safe level, and have it as a sort of wall within Cathedral Square. The costs of rebuilding have been widely vary from about $30 million to well over $100 million. However, there are international experts who have said that it's likely to be down that lower end, the $100 million plus figure being based on taking it down brick by brick and rebuilding it to current building standards. The Christchurch Earthquake Recovery Authority has backed the demolition due to safety concerns, and this decision was supported by 70 local church groups. But there has been widespread opposition to its demolition, including from the UNESCO World Heritage Centre, the Institute of Engineers, and many community groups. And very recently, just earlier this month, the High Court granted a judicial review into this matter, and we'll have to see how that continues. However, it's fair to say that even after 20 months after the earthquake, there is still the emergency legislation in place, and all the power rests with the Minister for Earthquake Recovery and the Christchurch Earthquake Reconstruction Authority. Now, just 1 year after Christchurch Cathedral was started, this lithograph by Gustave Doré entitled The New Zealander was published. It shows a New Zealander surveying the ruins of London from the South Bank as if he is surveying ancient Greece or Rome. My question is, perhaps Londoners will come and view the ruins of New Zealand.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jim. I'm sure we can, and there has been a conference just on this massive subject anyway. And sincere apologies to you for you've had a valiant struggle with technology. What we propose to do is just have a very quick 5-minute break, just to get the images sorted out. So thanks for that, Michael. So if you wouldn't mind sort of not leaving the room, but we'll just take if you could talk amongst yourselves, or perhaps it'd be a good opportunity for questions to Jim. We're going to be having the panel after the next two papers, but yes. Well, let's have some questions now for 5 minutes whilst we get the up and running.
Well, I'll ask anyway, and they can chatter. Jim, having visited Christchurch after the second earthquake, and I'd never been there before, what struck me was it was a very distinguished city with a wonderful plan and a very coherent architectural scheme, which had been, probably in the last 20 years, extremely compromised by very banal 10-storey high-rise buildings of the cheapest, nastiest kind. And it's not a unique Christchurch experience, it's a Hobart experience, it's an Adelaide experience, we see it everywhere. But in Christchurch it seemed particularly bad. And given that those 10-storey banal high-rise buildings are in fact the buildings that killed the most people, doesn't it seem a sort of logical plan to say we'll get rid of those, and the new Christchurch will be in the spirit of the old Christchurch, with beautifully designed, low-rise and medium density in the spirit of the Anglican Gothic city?
Thank you, Ian. I think you'd find a lot of people who agree with that sentiment. The Wizard of Christchurch, the people who are behind the fight to save the cathedral, a former employer of mine, the late Peter Bevan, who was campaigning vigorously for that outcome. The thing which is very pleasing for those who don't like banal 10-storey buildings is most of them are coming down too. Because basically, once reinforced concrete has been through an earthquake of that scale and there's been shearing of the reinforcing bars, they are irreparable. There are buildings which were built in the 2000s which had never been occupied but had just been finished, which are coming down before anyone has sat at a desk in them. So unfortunately, one of the worst buildings, which was designed by an architectural designer, it's a cheap and nasty hotel, it is the tallest building in Christchurch, that unfortunately, bad architecture but good engineering, so that's staying.
Which one is that?
It's a white building just near the tram depot. It's got a sort of spire on it reminiscent of the Parliament House in Canberra, except with a New Zealand flag at the top.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Michael. How are we doing with technology? No? Any other questions? Jane? I'll give you the microphone because it's good for the sound recording.
Christchurch is still having earthquakes, isn't it? It's still having aftershocks. And so making any decisions about what happens is in that context as well.
Okay, that's a very good point. After the February earthquake, it was following a sort of logarithmic decline, which is what you expect. So effectively, there are lots and lots of aftershocks, but they get smaller and smaller. So that was after the September earthquake. The February earthquake was a huge surprise because it wasn't performing as expected. It was expected it would just trail off. Some people were partway through restoration projects and earthquake strengthening projects when the second earthquake hit. But it has over the last, since February 2011, so we're nearly 2 years from that, it has followed that downward path with a couple of aftershocks. So I think there has to be a point at which, yes, there is always a risk of earthquakes. There's a higher risk in New Zealand than there is throughout most of Australia, but there has to be a point where emergency legislation is set to one side. The Christchurch City Council and a lot of the people have asked for a moratorium on these quick demolitions. However, that has not been given by the government.
I was just going to ask about the cardboard cathedral that's going up in Christchurch, just where it's going and what sort of impact it's going to have.
Well, I thought the cardboard cathedral is quite an exciting proposition. It's going in Latimer Square on the site of St John's Church, which has been destroyed. One of the things with the High Court decision recently is that the cathedral can't spend any of its insurance money on that project. That has to be used for either repair or building a new cathedral on the other site. But I think it would have been helpful if that could have given enough time for people to think carefully about what they do with the